Good afternoon, everyone, if you're on the East Coast. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. And good evening if you're in Europe or Asia. Welcome to the first Reach 3030 of 2021. What's our topic today? Well, we're going to talk about reach enforcement, which I think is of great interest to a lot of different companies. I get many calls from clients, and they want to know, what's the risk of doing A and B. Now, if you know anything about the U.S., you know TSCA is strict liability, and the EPA fines are very high. And that's true under TSCA and FIFRA and all the other programs that EPA administers. The European situation is quite different. At least historically, under REACH, penalties have been rare, though we do think that the situation may in fact well be changing. Why is it changing? Well, the 2018 registration tier is over, so all the existing chemicals or phase-in chemicals should have already been registered. There have been a lot of calls from European industry to get tough on imports in terms of imports that are not compliant with the legislation. And also, as we've spoken in the past, a lot of great interest in Europe in a circular economy, and a circular economy depends on that the products that are put on the market are, environmentally safe, and therefore failure to comply with the regulations becomes quite important in terms of the overall European strategy, which would lead to increased enforcement. Next slide, please. So I'm Herbert Estreicher. I give all of these. Next slide, please. As you may notice, since April of 2020, I've been joined on each of these Reach 3030s by my colleague, Alesh Bartel, who's an outstanding Czech lawyer in our Brussels office. Next slide, please. So what is reach enforcement all about? And when we talk about reach enforcement, it also applies to the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation. It also applies to the biocidal product regulation. It also applies to the PIC regulation, prior informed consent regulation. It also applies to the POP regulation. These are all the different pieces of legislation that the European Chemical Agency, the ECHA, administers. So one thing to remember, very important, is that enforcement under REACH and under all these other statutory instruments is actually carried out by the various member states. And so, as you know, there are now 27 member states. The United Kingdom is no longer a member state. It is now standing alone, somewhat isolated in Europe. So there are 27 member states, and each of them, quite frankly, has different enforcement provisions in place under their national legislation, and they all have different enforcement practices. In some member states, the enforcement is centralized. In other member states, such as Germany, the enforcement is done at the Länder or local authorities in the different sections of Germany, the different Länder, and so it's really substantially a mixed bag. And again, so if you have facilities in European Union and they're in different member states, there are a lot of different inspectors from different member states and different practices in different countries. Now, the European Chemical Agencies, or the ECHA, which administers REACH, is not an enforcement arm. It is a legislative arm. It can provide advice to the member states that there's a non-compliance, but it can't enforce. So its role is somewhat limited. There are calls to give ECHA the power to revoke registration in the case of registration numbers in the case of noncompliance, and that may well happen, but that legislation has not yet been introduced. Next slide, please. So what are the types of sanctions that the member states can impose? Well, they can certainly have fines, administrative penalties, and the amount of administrative penalties range from relatively small in some of the member states to large amounts. For example, I think Belgium has something like €200,000 per infraction. administrative penalties. And they could also impose fines, multiple fines, in the case of persistent noncompliance. They don't have per day penalties like they do under TSCA, but they can assess recurring fines in the case of persistent noncompliance. They could also order the prohibition to place an incompliant product on the market, and that's fairly common. If they have an inspection, they find a product that's in compliance, they will prohibit you from further placing that product on the market until it's brought into compliance. A lot of the member state authorities have provisions for misdemeanor criminal penalties, although these are rarely imposed. And it's usually cases involving the endangerment of human health and the environment. And if it would be imposed under REACH, it would most likely be in the area of restrictions or authorizations. In some countries, and actually in many of the countries, the authorities will first issue a warning letter. They'll give you time to come into compliance before assessing penalties or other types of sanctions. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague Alesh for a while, and I will rejoin you later in this webinar.
Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Herb. So as said, ECHA does not enforce, but ECHA does coordinate enforcement. And for this, there are regular REACH and Force projects, annual projects. And in this presentation, we will focus on 2019 REF7 project that was targeted to registration duties after the last registration deadline. Because the project report has been recently published. And this project is important for us, or interesting, because there was quite a big number of inspected companies, which gives us a representative sample to see how actually enforcement goes in the member states. Next slide, please. So as I said, the project, the report was published in December. Under the second bullet point, you should normally see it. It should be a link to that report. I see maybe that it doesn't work, but if you use Google, then REF7 project, you will immediately find the report. So the REF7 focus not only on whether the registration exists for a substance, but also on the quality of registration dossier. And the report states that for many member states, actually, this was a new exercise, because maybe some of the inspectors have not had sufficient knowledge so far to really go deep into the content of registration dossier, and especially on the updates, whether it's updated. So now it has been the focus of this project. So the inspectors focused on tonnage, production processes, life cycles, uses, whether they are up to date. Next slide, please. So just some statistics. So 813 companies inspected, 1,420 substances inspected. So quite impressive numbers. So the non-compliance rate, 180 substances, that means 15%, there was a non-compliance, broad non-compliance, not specified. But there was completely missing registration for 77 substances, that means 6.5%. The overall conclusion of the report was that there is a quite high rate of non-compliance. In my view, missing, for example, missing registration 6.5%. It's not that bad, given the fact that some of the companies may have relied on a REACH exemption, for example, on registration exemptions, or there are definitely some borderline cases. So I think it's actually not that bad. Next slide, please. Medium-sized enterprises were targeted in 61%, so it looks like they really targeted at registrations done in 2018 that were typically done by SMEs because it was a low tonnage registration. Pure on-site inspections, almost 900 as compared to 300 desktop inspections. That means that there is a prevalence of on-site inspections, and in some countries the inspectors do not have to announce themselves before starting inspection, so they can appear at any time at your premises. So so bear in mind that inspectors apparently still like to come on site. Only 14 companies played only the role of only representatives. So only 14 companies inspected were only representatives only. That maybe shows that only representatives are not overall a target for inspectors. Only during 45% inspections, inspectors checked more than one substance. So it would appear that they make a random choice and really focus on only one substance, and they don't go through the whole list. Only 4 out of 49 inspected ORs. 49 is more than 14 that I said before, but some of the companies are both, for example, importers and ORs. So only 4 out of inspected 49 ORs were non-compliant. So maybe the reason why ORs are not targeted that much is that ORs are presumed to be compliant with REACH because they are professionals and they have contractual obligations actually towards their clients. Next slide, please. Focus on intermediates. So this project focused on intermediates, and so 22.6 inspections focused on intermediates. In 32 cases, the intermediate registration was not acceptable. That means that the substance was not intermediate. 44 inspected companies did not apply strictly controlled conditions at all, which means, in principle, if strictly controlled conditions are not applied with your users, and inspectors find out that, then in principle you should immediately submit full registration. So it's actually the finding at your users that they do not apply strictly controlled conditions may be quite fatal for your business, because you would actually fall under the full registration obligation and potentially also under non-compliance. It would be non-compliant. Whereas the users themselves, in our review, do not commit any infraction because they don't have under REACH strictly obligation to apply strictly controlled conditions. The inspectors also focused on training, whether the workers are properly trained and protected. You see that actually non-compliance with training and prevention of exposure measures is relatively low. So this shows that companies do apply these measures. Next slide, please. Now the quality of dossier, in other words, whether the dossier is correctly and timely updated. The report stated that less than 50% of companies have system in place to update volumes and to update uses. And in our view, most of the non-compliance stated in the report were due to improper updates. That means that it was not updated. And the finding of the report is that most of the companies are not in the position to keep the deadlines listed in the upcoming, it has been already published, Commission implementing regulation on dossier updates. So I would really like to draw your attention to this new piece of legislation, because so far REACH only provided that dossier must be updated without undue delay. But this has changed with the publication of this regulation, which is already in force. it provides deadlines for each trigger point listed in Article 22. So for most of the changes, updates, there is a 3 months deadline. For example, for tonnage band, for uses. More complex gets 6 months. Some, for example, new classification, and very few 9 or 12 months. But the main rule is 3 months. So you should be aware of that and really introduce a system to track updates if not yet in place. Next slide, please. Now we go to sanctions. So as we will see on next slide, the most frequent enforcement measures were written advice and administrative orders. The administrative orders were not specified in the report, but typically administrative order will be order to cease marketing. The report says that for missing registrations, companies also received fines, which in the reading between the line means that for other non-compliance than missing registration, fines were rather rare. And the report says that in some cases, criminal prosecution was started. The level of fines was not reported in the report, but based on our experience, of course, depending on member states, the fines are not always dissuasive and may be actually lower than compliance costs. So there are some member states that impose quite important penalties, but in some member states, and let's say more east you go in Europe, less fines you can expect. But in some countries, it's really ridiculous, the level of fines. Next slide, please. So specific types of fines out of the 180 non-compliances. So you see quite a lot of advices. That means the inspector issued a warning, not a penalty. 42 administrative orders, which is quite a lot. So it shows that the cease of marketing is maybe often imposed, probably for missing registrations. Only 17 fines, which may look really low. 36 criminal complaints. But we have to take into consideration here that criminal complaint does not necessarily mean imprisonment. In some member states, the fines are imposed under criminal procedure, not under administrative procedure. So I think we can add these 36 criminal complaints to the fines actually group. 49 other measures. Company was asked to report the correct tonnage. The fines were paid quickly. This shows that there is some level of goodwill or benevolence with inspectors. If companies really remove non-compliance quickly, achieve compliance quickly, the authorities, the inspectors may actually not impose any fines. So I think we should, if you are in this situation, you should always try to show your goodwill to remove non-compliance quickly and to communicate it quickly in the supply chain if necessary, or whatever is necessary. And you may expect softer penalties. Next slide, please. The report stated that in 90% of cases, the various national authorities cooperated. I mean, within one member state, which is quite interesting number. It really shows that REACH enforcement is a common exercise of several enforcement authorities, and in 42% customs were involved. And I refer you to our December presentation, actually on market surveillance, where we outline that the powers or the enforcement enforcement capacity of customs increased with this new piece of legislation. They have now they have possibilities to really stop shipment at the border, to prohibit further marketing of a substance. So I think we will see customs more and more active, and maybe more and more using the cease of the marketing tool. On the other hand, only 33 inspections or results of inspections were exchanged with other member states, which again will change probably with the implementation of the new market surveillance regulation. But right now, the authorities in the EU do not communicate with each other. But again, this will change probably. Next slide, please. This was actually quite interesting statistics. So most inspections were held in the countries where it's not very surprising: Belgium, Germany, Spain, Netherlands. But I was quite surprised to see countries like Poland or Romania quite active. Because so far the kind of the rule was more east you go, less likely it is that you will get inspections, because the authorities were not up to speed on REACH, on EU regulations. They were understaffed, so the inspections were quite rare. So this seems to be changing. And if you look at the least inspections, actually, then very surprisingly, one of them is France, only 12 inspections, Austria, only 5 inspections, and other countries with low number of inspections is Luxembourg, Finland, and Denmark. Now it may show that their low willingness to participate at the REACH Unforced project, and maybe they focused on their own inspections. But yeah, it may also show that in these countries level inspections may be low, actually, surprisingly. Next slide, please. And I think for next slide, I hand over word to Herb.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alesh. Well, first of all, I think the countries that had low number of inspections as part of this enforced project are actually countries that inspect the most. So my sense is they probably thought that they already have inspected the companies within their countries quite a few times already, and so they didn't feel it was necessary to participate in this enforced project. That's my guess. I also thought if you know, we're going to put these slides up on our website. If you look at slide 13, where we have the statistics, the enforcement statistics, even though there are only 17 administrative penalties assessed, and I think there was something like 35 referrals to the criminal authorities, that's still a fairly large number, fairly large percentage compared to the past. So if you actually look at the enforced reports prior to this one, before 2018, it was very rare, if ever, that a penalty was assessed during these enforced projects. So that my take-home lesson is that enforcement is increasing in Europe. And as I indicated, there are several reasons for that. There's already been all the phase-in subs have been registered. There are calls to have customs more heavily involved to deal with imports. There's a need to ensure that products placed on the European market are in compliance because of circular economy and for other initiatives. So my take-home lesson, and which is going to be part of my advice to clients now on a routine basis, is now one cannot assume that you won't be seeing penalties. And so it becomes more important to ensure vigilance, particularly if you have facilities in the European Union, or you have, or you're supplying the European market, but you have strong, contractual provisions requiring you to indemnify your customers in the case of non-compliance, in case of assessment of penalties. I just want to talk about some of the other enforced initiatives. In 2019, there was one for the biocidal product regulation. That was the first one under the biocidal product regulation. That's why it's number one, and this focused on treated articles, which I thought might be of interest to this group as well. And you know what a treated article is an article which is treated with or contains biocidal products to preserve the article. Very, very common. And the inspections focused on labeling obligations and whether the biocidal substances that were in the treated articles were on an approved list. There were 22 countries inspected, 22 countries involved, engaged in the inspection. Over 1,100 companies were inspected. Over 1,800 treated articles were subject to inspection. And the results found actually quite good, that 64% of the treated articles that were inspected had complete and correct labeling, and there were only 2.5% contained a substance which was not on the approved list. So it's not bad. And there's the next biocidal product Unforce project, Unforce 2, has not yet been announced. Next slide, please. So there is already a project announced, well, I guess it was announced for 220. We're expecting to report the fourth quarter of 2021. And that dealt with products that are sold online. And we discussed in our December Reach 3030 the new obligations if you are selling remote distance online. And so that's inspection for that. And report is expected the fourth quarter of 2021. I suspect to find that they will find a lot of incompliance in terms of products that are sold by the internet. Next slide, please. There's another one scheduled for 2021 that'll focus on reach authorization. Next slide, please. And there's already been one announced, Ref 2 to Ref 10 for 2022. And what we understand, this is going to involve the interface of the chemical legislation, REACH, CLP, the BPR with other product regulation, and it'll mainly focus on waste. And this is part of the whole circular economy issues that we've been talking about the last number of webinars. Also registration, other obligations related to recovered products or products being recycled. So as you know, if you're recycling in Europe, you are not required to register the substances that you recycle if they've already been registered with somebody else in Europe. However, if you're recycling outside Europe and sending in the recycled goods, you have to register those goods. So there's a disconnect between imported recycled products and EU produced recycled products. But in any event, there are also classification labeling requirements associated with recycled products, which are very difficult and very hard to comply with. And so my guess is the inspection may focus on that. It's possible that there will be an inspection on the SCIP database, substance of concern and products. I know that if you're in Europe, you were very busy meeting the January 5th compliance date for notifying for the SCIP database. If you're outside Europe, you were probably very busy helping your customers comply with that thing. There'll also be enforcement on no longer waste status. So what does that mean? Well, you know, wastes are outside the scope of REACH, but something may not actually be a waste. It may be considered to be a product. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about the requirements that apply to things that are believed to be waste, but in fact not waste. And as always, there may well be enforcement on ROS, which is a provision on heavy metals content of electronic products. Next slide, please. So the next OSHA 3030 is on January 27th at 1 o'clock. The next TSCA 3030 is on February 17th at 1 o'clock. Next slide, please. So we have moving for REACH 3030s to a bi-monthly every 2 months, bi-monthly program, So we decided to do that. We might later this year have another REACH in the interim month, and I saw another 3030 in another month on another topic. But we decided to move the REACH 30/30s to every other month. The Tosca 30/30s will still remain once a month, but the Reach 30/30s will be held every other month. And the next one is on March 17th. And I don't know if people think that's a good idea or a bad idea, but in any event, we are moving it to every other month. We will consider, maybe having another topic in the interim months, but we're still thinking about that. Anyway, I'm Herbert Estreicher, and I was joined by my colleague Alesh Bartel, and we'll see you in middle of March. And thank you for participating and taking time out today to listen to us. Take care, everybody.